Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and since the last video about the latest Ascendancy changes, another 5 Ascendancies have come out for us to review, and I'm going to go over them throughout this video somewhat quickly, I hope. Just give my thoughts on each one, what's changed, maybe what builds we can do with them, but for the most part just analysing what has changed and what is now different and what they're doing with the current Ascendancies. The ones that have changed are Guardian, Assassin, Hierophant or Hierophant, Pathfinder and Champion. Now Pathfinder barely got anything, and that's because as they've said, they are reworking a lot of Ascendancies and making them very competitive compared to each other Ascendancy, but some are already fairly strong and don't really need many changes, which is why we hardly saw any change from Berserker and also hardly any change here from this Pathfinder. But let's first of all start things right off with the Guardian. And let's jump right into the Assassin. So the Assassin did get a fairly heavy rework since last time it was nerfed. It got nerfed when the double dipping changes were sort of changed as well. And overall it wasn't going to be as strong for poison and bleed as it used to be, and it did kind of lose its identity and a lot of the reason that people would have played it. And then as well as that, the crit got nerfed at some point to be less than per power charge and then just give a flat 2 crit, so it lost some of its identity there as well, and it's been in a tricky place. So currently it is being rebuffed, and what the buffs look like are Noxious Strike, so 40% chance to poison on hit. That's roughly the same. It's not dependent on bleed anymore, however, so it's just a flat 40% poison on hit. 50% chance to maim on hit against poisoned enemies, so that should be up 100% of the time. 0.1% critical strike chance per poison affecting an enemy, up to 2%. That's to your base critical strike chance, so that is quite big, and it should get up to about 2% against the heavy single target. Enemies that you will be poisoning quite rapidly with your poison build that will definitely be using a lot of poison stacks, as that's going to be the most efficient way to build poison. And then on top of that, the 5% increased poison duration per poison applied recently, which is crazy. So that is a shitload of extra poison duration with the right builds and the right setups, and ultimately an absolute ball load of extra damage. It's pretty crazy, I think, and I'm not really sure if it's particularly smart with the way that poison's going to be scaling to give this big of a poison duration per poison applied recently buff. I think it's kind of, at this stage anyway, this one node right here in and of itself has essentially made every other class, I think, fairly useless, or Ascendancy rather, fairly useless when looking at poison, and Assassin is going to be 100% the poison spec of choice, which it currently is, but it's a little bit more debatable. You could potentially go Pathfinder, Berserker, Raider, something like that. With this change, unless the other things change to some extent as well, and have not seen any evidence of that yet, then Assassin is definitely going to be the only thing you can do for poison, unless you really want to gimp your damage. So I think that's very big and a huge node, especially for the fast attacking poison builds, which I think should be just about all of them. And then Toxic Delivery hasn't really changed. They did remove the bleed portion of the node, and then also added Recover 0.5% in max life per poison affecting enemies you kill, which as a poison build you will definitely still be taking because of the extra poison damage, but you now have this huge quality of life of sustain while mapping, because 0.5% of your max life per poison affecting an enemy is actually quite a lot. I think typically an enemy that you're going to be killing, even through white trash mobs, etc., should have, I'm going to say, at least 5 poison stacks on them. So we're looking at 2.5% of your max life per poison. If you're running, 5k life, then we're talking about 125 life per enemy killed, just straight up, and you're going to be killing a lot, and it's going to be coming in all over the place. So 125, just a very conservative estimate of 5 poisons per enemy. 125 life gained on kill is hugely nice sustain, and should feel pretty close to a Val Pact a lot of the time when you're killing things fairly constantly. So that node you're taking anyway. It's just really nice quality of life for the poison builds. We then have Ambush and Assassinate, which was the previous 4 points for low life, full life, crit stuff, and that got condensed into 2 simple points instead. Pretty much the same sort of stuff. There's 100 more crit strike chance against enemies that are on full life, and 100 more crit strike chance against enemies on low life. And that is a lot of extra crit strike chance. But the issue is you're probably not really going to see much difference there anyway, because an assassin with deadly infusion will, for the most part, be very crit capped and not really need any additional crit. So 100% more just at low life, the last 35%, doesn't really help too much, I don't think. You probably won't notice it terribly much. The biggest part of that node is still culling strikes for your crits. At least that's my opinion, unless you specifically try and build a lot less crit somehow, so that you can utilize that sort of stuff more on the low life and the full life aspect. So nothing too huge there, but for 2 points it is a lot better than it used to be for 4 points, so a decent little node. We then lastly have Opportunistic, and that is 20% increased movement speed if you've killed recently. Pretty nice for your mapping. Damage from your critical strike cannot be reflected. Now there's not much reflect out there in the game anymore, but for maps purely that have Fizz Reflect or Elemental Reflect, if you're an assassin, you're probably going to be just about crit capped, and every piece of real damage you do will be crit. Chances are you can probably start running some reflect maps with this node, and maybe the Yugal Ascendancy, not Ascendancy, Pantheon. So, that's going to be nice just to be able to run those maps. I'm wagering you'll be able to, but maybe it'll still hurt too much anyway. Besides that, nothing too special in that node. 100% increased damage while there is only one nearby enemy, so that's quite a lot of extra damage on pure single target. The only issue is there's not going to be too many bosses out there or single target situations where you are strictly soloing an enemy. For example, Shaper, there's a few phases here or there that you will be solo purely against him. The new Shaper vs Elder fight, you're probably going to be facing both at once almost all of the time. It's Ziri herself. Just, some of the phases there, you will get some good single target time alone against her. The Elder fight, he spawned some ads, but doesn't really matter too much. None of the Elder Guardians really matter too much. And as far as the tier 16 Guardians, you're looking at Phoenix is always going to have ads pretty much. Minotaur, just about always going to be spawning ads. And Hydra is probably the only one you can really get some solid single target time against. And then Chimera, because there's no ads in his actual phases that you attack him on, but the problem is you don't really need extra single target against him. He doesn't have a whole lot of life anyway. So I think that node, it's nice, but not particularly valuable. Likewise with the take no extra damage from crit strikes while there's only one nearby enemy, it's just going to be kind of a rare occurrence for that to happen, I think. But when it does, that is a very strong node, and it's one you're probably going to be taking when you're going pure crit anyway for the Deadly Infusion, Ambush Assassinate, and Opportunistic. So it's still a good solid 4 big nodes there. And if you're going pure poison, you're going to be going up to Toxic Delivery and then probably down to Deadly Infusion anyway. But if you can manage to crit cap yourself, maybe you want some Opportunistic instead. It's a bit up in the air, but I think poison builds should be pretty strong. A good Wasp Nest, the one that I've made for example, with Spectral Throw and Blade Flurry, all this sort of shit should be fairly insane at this point, and probably a really nice league starter. May even include it in my video when I make one. But yeah, just a lot of poison builds will be probably a bit stronger, a bit more comfortable to play as Assassin. But the only real downside is I'm not sure you can play anything but Assassin for poison anymore, so that's maybe a bit of a shame. Now, all kidding aside, I will have a quick look at the Guardian. I don't really have anything to do with Guardians. Don't think I've ever even made one. It's just a very tanky and utility-based Ascendancy, one that kind of, shoots towards Aurabot, Auramancer, and playing with other people, or just being really tanky, so it's not something I've ever actually done. But the changes there haven't actually been very big anyway. Basically, Unwavering Faith hasn't changed, Radiant Faith hasn't changed, Prayer of Glory hasn't changed, Time of Need, which you can see right there, hasn't changed, and then we only have a couple minor changes in Bastion of Hope and Harmony of Purpose. So Harmony of Purpose now just gives a lot easier sustain for your, or just generation and sustain for your Power Frenzy Endurance charges. So it's got now 10% chance to gain Power Frenzy or Endurance charge on hit, which is pretty good, should be fairly reliable to get a lot of all 3 of those charges. And then Bastion of Hope got changed to be a little bit more reliable. So you now get 50% additional block chance for 2 seconds every 5 seconds, as opposed to every 1 for 5. So you get it up, 40% of the time. And that's quite a lot. It's fairly tanky. It's not something you really want to rely on. Once again, just a little bit of a buff every now and again. You want buffs that are going to always be up. But it is big and it should feel really tanky at those times if you're not investing too heavily in it anyway. And then you also have you and nearby allies cannot be stunned if you've blocked in the past 10 seconds, which is not too bad. If you've attacked recently, you and nearby allies have 10% chance to block attacks. And if you've cast a spell recently, you and nearby allies have 10% chance to block spells. So chances are you are going to be shield charging around and casting spells, so 10% chance to block both attacks and spells is fairly handy and a little bit of a buff from the previous node. Like I said, I do not mess with Guardians too much. They are not really my forte, so you're probably better off looking to someone else for those builds and advice around Guardians and the new changes. And I'll get rid of Pathfinder real quick because there's not much to talk about here. Basically, none of these changed. The only little change that actually occurred was Nature's Boon went from 8% reduction to your elemental damage taken to 6%. And then Flasks, instead of gaining 1 charge every 3 seconds, now gain 3 charges every 3 seconds. And this was already, I'm pretty sure, affected by a Flask effect. So instead of gaining 1 charge every 3 seconds, you'd randomly gain 2 sometimes. So 3 could eventually turn into 4 or 5. And that's a pretty huge buff for your sustain on Flasks. I'm not terribly sure it's too necessary because it's already been pretty easy to sustain Flasks as a Pathfinder. At least that's how I've found the playstyle. You're almost always going to have your Flasks up. This node over here is pretty crazy already, and it's just gotten a bit better. So I think, in essence, what this node for me does is mean I probably don't have to get any Flask modifiers onto my belt slot anymore, like the reduced Flask charges used on a belt, which I used to like for a bit of extra Flask sustain. I'm not sure that's really necessary anymore, so it is a pretty nice little quality of life gain, and then you lose 2% reduction in elemental damage taken. I don't think that's a really big deal. I do think it's a bit of a shame that Master Surgeon didn't get any love or rework at all, as well as Master Herbalist. This, I think, feels a bit out of place right now. You're pretty much, I don't think, ever going to be going Pathfinder or Poison, especially not in its current state compared to Assassin. So this node may as well not be here anymore as far as I'm concerned, because it's not even that good anymore. 60% chance of poison on hit. You can get that extra poison on hit in other places, especially Assassin and the passive tree, and then the damage is pretty weak by comparison. And Master Surgeon itself is fairly dead at this point. You don't really use it for anything. And for the most part, you're only ever taking these 4 nodes here, which are very good and very strong nodes. So these just cannot compete at the moment, I don't think. And I'm a little confused that they didn't get any love while this got a bit of a slight tweaking. Overall, Pathfinder is still really good Ascendancy and should still be really fun to play, but there will be plenty of other things that are changed in other Ascendancies that may make Pathfinder just a little less desirable now, considering it hasn't really received too much of an overhaul. Now we have the 2 big boys left in Ascendancies that have been changed, Hierophant and Champion. Start with Hierophant, and it's pretty much a full rework. It was kind of a totem Ascendancy before, and it did keep some of its mana node stuff down here. But for the nodes themselves, it is a fairly large rework. So we'll start with the first 2 points you're going is Illuminated Devotion, 25% increased area effect while you have Arcane Surge, and 0.5% of spell damage leached as life while you have Arcane Surge, and 40% increased spell damage while you have Arcane Surge. Now currently keeping up Arcane Surge through an Orb of Storms attachment with a Power Charger on crit, for example, is pretty easy and fairly reliable under most casting circumstances, so just that by itself is really huge and very nice, because Spell Leech isn't easy to acquire almost anywhere else, and that is equivalent to Warlord's Mark against most bosses and all of that. Gives you a bit of extra area and a bit of extra spell damage. So just for the 2 nodes, this is pretty strong, and I'd say going to be worth taking in most spellcaster builds, and gives Hierophant a strong case to be a different spellcaster as opposed to your usual Inquisitor, for example. If you really want, you can also go 2 points deeper and gain Arcane Reverence, which gives you Arcane Surge when you or your totems hit an enemy with a spell. And then you're also immune to elemental ailments while you have Arcane Surge. Problem with this node is Arcane Surge that it gives you is going to be a level 1 Arcane Surge, so it's the weakest form, 10 spell, 10 cast, and 0.5 max mana regen for 4 seconds. It will be up all of the time basically, but I don't think getting Arcane Surge is that big of a deal or that hard that you would go out of your way to get this thing for 2 entire points, because you're basically going to be paying 2 points just for immune to elemental ailments while you have Arcane Surge. And in some cases, absolutely worth it. You will still be taking that because that is very nice for lots of endgame things to be purely immune to elemental ailments. But in many cases, I'm not sure it's going to be worth it for these 2 points. So if I ever build a Hierophant, I'm possibly going to be avoiding something like this because it's just a quality of life, but I do not mind having to keep up my own buffs like an Arcane Surge in favor of getting something better. Then we move on to Convocation of Power, which is just 2 points purely. You have a 25% chance to gain Endurance Charge when you gain a Power Charge, 50% chance to gain a Power Charge when you place a totem, and that should keep your power charges up pretty damn all the time if you're a totem character, thus giving you a lot of endurance charges as well. 15% chance to gain a power charge if you or your totems kill an enemy, so that's going to be up 100% of the time while mapping, absolutely, and that just gives it even more reliability. And then 5% reduced elemental damage taken while you have an endurance charge, which is just a bit of extra tankiness, very nice there. And damage penetrates 5% elemental resist while you have a power charge, which isn't anything huge, but it is a nice bit of extra damage that brings it a bit closer to, say, an Inquisitor. So nothing too huge there, just a bit of quality of life. We then move into the big totem nodes. Pursuit of Faith, which, let me get rid of the cam right here. Pursuit of Faith gives you 100% totem duration, can have up to 1 additional totem summoned at a time, 6% increased damage per enemy killed by you or your totems recently, and 10% attack and cast speed while you have a totem. And these little nodes in between should have some, I think, 20% totem placement speed. So paired with this node, you have almost 100% totem placement speed, which is huge quality of life for playing totems and makes it a lot more of a smoother gameplay. And I may as well read this one out now. So you get an additional totem summoned at a time from this one. The placement speed, you regenerate 0.5% of mana per second per totem. Now if you're running 3 or 4 totems, that's 1.5 to 2% mana regen per second, which is pretty damn handy. And then you or your totems regenerate 1% life per second per totem, which once again 3 or 4% life regen, nothing to sneeze at. So this one over here, the duration I'm not sure really matters too much, but an additional totem, bunch of extra damage whenever you kill stuff, that's the same. 10 attack and cast speed, a little bit of quality of life. The main take home here is now you can get 4 totems down through a usual totem build if you choose to not attack yourself at all and take the totem nodes on the tree. 4 totems without any loss of damage like the previous Hierophant. So that's 4 totems, you get a lot of placement speed, and let's just say you put down 4 Warchief totems with a one-way ticket to Pound Town. That's going to be pretty strong. So quad Warchief Hierophant's really nice, though people do and can argue that Chieftain's really good as well. Personally, if I were to play something like this, I'd probably go 3 totems and not take the one on the tree so that I can still attack things myself, jump around, do some sundering, drop 3 totems, and Pound Town single target, so it should be a lot stronger that way. It's a really competitive Ascendancy and probably the only real Ascendancy you should be thinking about as a pure totem character, at least at this stage. So similar to the Assassin for Poison, Hierophant now totems. And that might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. I guess that's up to everyone else to decide, because it just really pigeonholes you, I think, into a certain Ascendancy if you want to play totems. Like I said, there will be some other debates and choices. War Chiefs can go to Chieftains pretty well as well. Scion, for example, haven't seen the rework there. I'd wager a guess that there's going to be some decent rework into Scion doing things fairly competitively to the other Ascendancies at the moment, so that perhaps if you want to play a totem character, you go Hierophant or Scion. If you want to play Poison, Assassin, or Scion. But we have yet to see that. That's just a guess and maybe some hope on my behalf. But at this stage, yeah, it looks like playing a Hierophant totem-wise. At the start of the league especially, totem characters are very strong and stable starter characters. should be really strong and feel pretty good to play at this point. Maybe even something I'll do because it doesn't look that uncomfortable or that painful to play, so probably worth doing. And as well as that, we did have a slight rework over here in Sanctuary of Thought, where nothing else really changed, but 10% less mana reservation, which is fairly huge for reservation on your auras, and is competitive with a couple of the nodes that are on the passive tree at the moment that help reserving your mana. So you get a lot of mana through these skills here, and then 10% less mana reservation is fairly quality of life. Not too sure which ones you're going to be comboing. As I said, if I'm going to make a totem character, it's quite possibly just going to be these 4 here, and then these 2 and these 2, so you get lots of charges, get some penetration, you get the buff from Arcane Surge, and I'll, play totems with placing them myself, arcane surging things myself, and just hopefully relying on some really meaty totem action to carry me to victory. Now the last rework we're going over is Champion, which is a pretty huge rework, so it still has kept a few of its core abilities and what it's all about, but there were some fairly big changes and reworks, and I think it's a pretty exciting Ascendancy at this point. I have previously never really looked at Champion and thought, I want to make me one of those. I've always looked at Champion and thought, is it about time I play one of these? Read every node? No, because I always compare it to a Slayer or a Berserker or something like that, and I just think I don't see a reason to play this. At this stage, looking at the new Champion, I feel like I want to play a Champion. It looks pretty damn good. So we'll start with the Fortify nodes, the ones that have changed the least, I think. So you grab the first 2 points and then the last 2 points for actual Fortify. You have Fortify, hasn't changed at all, but the first 2 points are pretty huge now. We have Unstoppable Hero. 10% increased attack speed while you have Fortify, 30% increased melee damage while you have Fortify, 1000 to armor and evasion rating while you have Fortify, and cannot be stunned while you have Fortify. Cannot be stunned is really nice, bit of extra attack speed and melee damage, but 1000 armor and evasion is fairly huge, especially in the leveling process early on. If you take it as your first 2 nodes, you'll be borderline unkillable up until level 70 or so, and it's just a fairly solid base to build your character around for endgame defense. 1000 armor and evasion should be just a solid base that you can then work into for extra armor, extra evasion, maybe iron reflexes if you really want, and a good negation to an abyssus if you want to start looking into that for your extra damage in the character, or just run the usual Belly the Beast Star Conjure, and all of a sudden you're a pretty hybrid character. You can have 30-40% dodge, or rather evasion and armor, and you should feel really good, especially with the Fortify node if you grab that. But likewise to the Hierophant with the Arcane Surge, I'm not sure I'd ever really be grabbing this because you have Fortify is something that's not terribly necessary. It's something you should be able to keep up a lot of the time in most of your characters. The only reason I feel like I should be grabbing this node here, or these 2 nodes over here, are in characters that can't get Fortify, like let's say you want to make a Champion Wander or a Champion Bow character, in which case you have Fortify is huge for those 2 characters, or for that type of character, and I'd say very worth grabbing. For the most part though, for your attack-based builds, I think you should be relying on your Fortify from your Leap Slam, your Shield Charge, your Whirling Blades, and you should be able to keep that up as often as you like. It's just a little less reliable because obviously it's not going to be up 100% of the time, but you should be able to make it last well enough. So I think that's a huge node, and by itself feels really good just to grab it for defensive purposes as a champion. You then have First to Strike, Last to Fall. So your hits permanently intimidate enemies that are on full life. So all you gotta do is get a hit in on anything before it takes any damage, and you will permanently intimidate, which is a 10% increase in damage from attack damage. So that's already just a 10% buff right there if you don't have intimidate elsewhere. Gain adrenaline for 20 seconds when you reach low life if you do not have adrenaline. Remove all ailments and burning when you gain adrenaline. Now adrenaline says grants 100% increased damage, that's pretty huge, 25% attack, cast and movement speed, and 10 physical damage reduction. All of that's pretty huge, and I think the idea behind this is you're going to want to grab this node and get yourself to low life before a certain boss fight and have adrenaline for 20 seconds. Now, how are you going to do that? Quite likely blood magic and aura. So blood magic, a 35% aura or something, that'll take you to 70% reservation below the threshold for low life. That'll trigger your low life. If you have enough life regen or just a life flask, pop the life flask once, or just regen up for a couple of seconds, and all of a sudden you have adrenaline for the next 15 seconds, which is a huge damage boost in 100% damage and 25 attack speed, which is huge, like I just mentioned. And it should last long enough for most boss fights to end fairly quickly. Likewise, you could probably press Righteous Fire, and by the time you get to 35% low life, adrenaline kicks in and it turns off your burning, thus turning off the Righteous Fire. Not quite sure if that's exactly how that'll work, but it seems like it might, and that could be an easy activator for your adrenaline. Something to play around with, and looks like a pretty nasty node overall. You then have Inspirational, which is you and nearby allies deal 35% increased damage. I don't think that's changed, and you and nearby allies have 12% increased movement speed. For 2 points, it's not incredible. 35% increased damage, it's not more, it's just increased. So if you've already got 500% damage, 35 is not going to shatter the universe, but for 2 points, if you've got nothing else, maybe it's okay. You then have Conqueror and Worthy Foe. So Conqueror has 100% chance to hit, to taunt on hit, 6% reduced damage taken if you've taunted an enemy recently, so should be pretty much always perma 6% reduced damage taken, 2% life regen if you've taunted recently, perma 2% life regen, and enemies taunted by you deal 10% less damage with hits and ailments against other targets. So just kind of, you become a tank like in World of Warcraft for your friends, which if you have friends, not all of us do, you can then get a little bit tankier, or be a bit tankier as a character for yourself and help your friends out with a bit more tankiness. Overall, I'm not sure it's going to factor in too much, but the node itself is fairly solid, 100% chance to taunt on hit, and then a bit of defensive options there, which then builds into Worthy Foe, which is enemies you taunt take 20% increased damage. That's pretty big. And then enemies taunted by you cannot evade attacks, which is also rather large. So to start with, 20% increased damage taken. It's not a more multiplier, but considering an enemy typically has 0% increased damage taken, an additional 20% is basically 20% more damage taken. So pair the 20% damage taken here with the Intimidate, and if you're not currently getting Intimidate anywhere else, that's 30% damage to your overall character as a huge boost. So Berserker has 40% more damage, whereas this means is also fairly competitive because an enemy can take 30% more damage by himself there, and that does bring up the gap of the DPS to, let's say, a Berserker quite handily by itself. And then you have enemies taunted cannot evade attacks. So what that means is you have a 100% chance to hit the enemy. So that replaces your Resolute Technique, it replaces your Lycosidae, and it just saves you getting all kinds of accuracy, but it also gives you more accuracy than you can normally achieve. So similar to a Resolute Technique, except you can still crit, so that's really big. Similar to a Lycosidae, except you don't have to use a shield slot that costs a lot. So that's a really huge node, and that's largely the reason I'm looking at Champion thinking that's competitive. I might want to do that, because not having to get accuracy is really comfortable, and getting all that extra damage throughout the Taunt and the Intimidate is also really nice too. And then on top of that, I will probably for the first time have some decent defense without really trying too hard, and it should build a very strong starter character, or just general melee character anyway. Yeah, it's just at the moment looks like it's on a similar sort of par to Slayer, maybe the Gladiator, Berserker. We will have to wait and see what changes, if any, we get to a Juggernaut, a Slayer, a Gladiator, because all of those can have big things coming. I would expect some of them definitely have a few changes coming. Let's say the Gladiator, I would potentially expect it to be more of a bleed-based character now, since Assassin got rid of all bleed and is just now purely poison. There's got to be bleed somewhere, and the Gladiator currently just gives a bit of chance to bleed. I feel like maybe there'll be a bit more bleed damage involved, and centered more around bleed in general. But I think Champion looks really good, and I think it's a strong Ascendancy at the moment. That's currently my opinion. So this should have ended up being a real quick video, only 30 minutes of us looking at basically 3 Ascendancies. And yeah, it seems that I can just talk a bunch of bullshit about anything for a really extended period of time. Sorry for taking so long about that, but there is a lot that we can discuss, and probably even more if I really wanted to. But for now, I think that would do, just as a review for the current Ascendancies we've been given. I'm still thoroughly looking forward to Elementalist personally, because that should get a really big shake-up, and it's always been a fun one in the past. And then seeing what happens in Scion probably, and of course should be a little bit exciting too. I'm not sure it really needs any changes, but if some come, that'd be pretty fun. For now though guys, hope you enjoyed the video and the analysis/review. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.